right, welcome back to On the Ball, the video podcast from the Vanderbilt Sports and Society Initiative. I'm Andrew Maraniss, and really excited to have my good friend Lou Moore joining us today to talk about his new book that just came out on Tuesday, The Great Black Hope, um, about the evolution of the black quarterback in pro football, really focusing on Doug Williams and Vince Evans, uh, jumping off point of a game they played against each other in 1979, where it was the first time there was two starting black quarterbacks facing off in the NFL game. So much to talk about in this interview. Lou, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And sorry, I'm only wearing a t-shirt. I literally just got back from the gym, took a shower, and I was like, I can't put on anything else. Like I'm
Oh,
sweating and stuff like that. So
hey man, it's like humble brag. You just got back from the gym. Like
yeah.
how much are you lifting these days, Lou?
Oh man, I'll never tell. I'll never tell. Not a lot, not a lot. I actually don't. Today was chest and back day, but I don't do bench.
Okay.
Just because I don't want to, I don't want to see people. I don't want people to see me struggling with very little weight on there. So
Hey, I mean, I work in an athletic department, and a lot of my fellow colleagues here played football in their past, and
yeah.
so I mean, they put me so much to shame that I don't even have to worry about it. Like, it's pretty funny. All right, so my first question to you, Lou, in reading the acknowledgments, your friend, no jump shot Todd, like, how did this guy deserve that that's the way the world knows him? What's the story with Todd?
Yeah, so Todd and I are like, so all those guys in that, and where my friends, I've known them. I think I said in there since day one. It's true. Like since I moved to SoCal in like sixth, seventh grade, and so we've known each other, and that's like a really inside thing that we joke with each other. So whenever we see each other once a year, everyone expects us to go at it like jokingly about basketball, our glory days, like 30 years in the past. And so we've been playing against each other since the sixth grade. And I realized like with acknowledgments, I have an opportunity to have the ultimate dig. So you can make fun of me in the group chat, but what I do is always permanent. And so that is the goal of writing every book. And it's in the other books too. That same acknowledgement is it. I just keep it up, and so I think this one just mentions that he's a fowler now, right? He's just a more physical player. So yeah, that's my good friend Todd since I was like 11 years old. So
That's awesome. Yeah, that'll be in the Library of Congress, for
that's
all
right.
time.
Everybody,
People will be
everybody.
wondering about that 200 years from now. Um, all right, so back to the book. This seems like a book that you were born to write, but I know that choosing a topic for a book is usually a lengthy process. Finding a publisher that agrees that it's going to be a good book is not always easy. So what's the story of, when did you decide this is the book you wanted to pursue, and what was the journey like to get it published?
Yeah, so that's a long journey. So let's talk. So I think it's helpful because I'm an academic, so we come from different places. And so before this, I'll say I have two books, right? I have the one on boxing, so I fight for a living, and then I have We Will Win the Day. And they're both different process, right? I fight for a living was a dissertation into a book. And at that time in your career, you're limited to where you go, right? It's I mean, how many academic presses put out sports books? And there's very few, and few of them have sports series and stuff. And so it's like Syracuse, Tennessee, Nebraska, Illinois, and now kind of UNC, but they don't really have a sports part. So you're limited, and you take what you get and then you move on. We'll win the day. I don't know what type of publisher it was, but somebody approached me. I was like, yeah, I'll do it. It was more of an academic, but we're gonna sell it to a library type. So I didn't have to like push it or anything. They wanted this type of book. I gave them that book. This was different, and the subject was different, right? Like the boxing one, I had been working on it since I was an undergrad my senior year, and then did it master's, PhD. The We Will Win the Day, they approached me. I probably would have wrote it eventually in my career, but it just happened they approached me. This one, as you said, it's me. It's like this is what I want to do. I've been, obviously watching football my whole life, been like into the black quarterback as long as I've been watching. And when I started watching, it was like what Warren Moon, right? And Randall Cunningham. So
Mhm.
you had two, but they're two great ones. And I was looking for the next thing to do, knew I wanted to do something on the black quarterback. And I've been speaking to you for the last 4 years about this, trying
Mhm.
to figure out that topic because I had never done something like this where I'm gonna stay on topic. Like my other books, they're all thematic, right? And I think those are hard in a way, but they're easy because if you just move the pieces around, you have something. Here's 6 chapters, 7 chapters.
Mhm.
This is like I wanted to tell a story. And then I had to kick around like, well, what story can I tell that also people will buy? I didn't know that second part that also people will buy. And that's, talking to people who've been in the trade world, they were super nice to me without saying like, hey, yeah, nobody's gonna buy that. Like understanding like, nobody wants a book on, Johnny Walton, right? Like who's, he's actually an autobiography on him, his own. But nobody wants that, right? Nobody wants a book as much as we like Jeff Blake.
Right.
Nobody probably wants a book on Jeff Blake. I want a book on Jeff Blake, and like some Twitter people want it, but a publisher's not going to do it. So you have to pick a topic that you think will sell. I wanted to do the black quarterback, and I wanted to tell a story. And so, what story's out there, right? There's probably a few of them, and they end with the Super Bowl, and Doug's the biggest one. But there's also a different story, I thought, with the game, with the Doug Williams versus Vince Evans games, which is coming on the 45th, if my math is correct, anniversary, because that game was September
Mhm.
30th, 1979. And I was just kicking around ideas. And then there's this Pro magazine. I don't know, it used to be up here behind me, but it has Doug on the cover, but inside of it, it's like 1981. It's like spreads on Vince Evans and Doug Williams. And I said, oh, this is perfect. And then I started digging. It's like, oh, there's some articles like in real time on this game. And the writers, whether it's the Sun Times, LA Times, various black newspapers are trying to make this a big deal. So let me think about how I can make it a big deal. And so that was the whole point of writing this book, I'm trying to tell a story, getting up to that point. Now, I realized later on that the big point is not necessarily the game that will sell to the readers. It's not just that game, but it's Doug's Super Bowl. And so
Mhm.
as a writer and crafting the story, I knew eventually I had to get there. And that's when your editor comes in and says, like, look, you got to get there. So like if it was just me, it would just be that game. But obviously the better choice is to end with the Super Bowl. I know
Got
it's
it.
long-winded, but yeah, there we go.
No, that's great. And as someone, I was 9 years old in 79, and then I remember both of those quarterbacks. I lived in DC. I remember Doug Williams, that Super Bowl. I was kind of a Washington fan. I've always been a Packers fan first, but following that team. And so I'm felt coming into this book that I was somewhat familiar with Doug Williams' Grambling story, and Buccaneers and Washington, but didn't really know much about Vince Evans other than he was the Bears quarterback, and I don't like the Bears, so I don't like Vince Evans. Was my only memory of him. Um, it was interesting to read about both of their backgrounds being, um, different and how they arrived at this moment. Let's start with Vince Evans and a little bit about his background and how he arrives on the field at Soldier Field in 1979. Like what got him there?
Yeah, and I'll say I was so lucky when I just picked this topic and the topic kind of fell in love. Just everything lined up perfectly because they are both. You talk about their backgrounds; they're both born in 1955 in the South. It's like, oh, great starting point. But at that moment, everything kind of goes in a different direction. And so, if we're doing Vince, he's raised in Greensboro, North Carolina, and so if listeners know, that's one of the hubs of the civil rights movement, right? That's where the sit-ins take place. His family, the best way to describe it is black middle class. They're educators in a city that takes black education seriously. All their teachers, like the majority is like something like 80%. I don't know what the stat I gave, have their master's degrees, black teachers, right? And very good black public schools, very good black high school where a lot of talented athletes are from, but also just students. There's a black college there, there's a black women's college there. So education is central to Greensboro, right? And then there's the sit-ins, but at the same time, there's a movement to integrate schools. And so part of the journey of Vince Evans is being that journey, right? He's the kid that goes from a school that was formerly all white to all black. He has to sit there. He's the kid that, as I try to explain to people, it's like remember the Titans, right? He's getting bussed into the school that's predominantly white school, and he's the quarterback. And so that's his life, right? And I think as the quarterback going to this school at the moment that they have busing and integration is a big deal, because you're the symbol and the quarterback's the symbol of the city, and everyone's looking to football to see how the city's going to react. I know Remember the Titans kind of takes it to a whole nother level, but I think it's like that in every city in the South in 1971, right? Because
Mhm.
fall is the first time schools integrate and football is right there. And so it's the first time we get to see if integration is going to work if you're in the South in 1971. And
Mhm.
Vince is a junior quarterback running the single wing offense. And I think this is so important to the story and to me understanding football, because I had to learn, okay, what's the single wing offense? Because you would read about it like single wing, okay, whatever.
Right.
Let me look this up. Why is this such a big deal in 1971?
Yeah.
Well, it's an old offense in 1971, and there's no, it's he's the quarterback, but he's really a running back playing quarterback. It's like the Wildcat, right? And it was like I said, it was old in 71 because everybody switched to the T formation. Okay, so what's the T formation, right? And so part of learning about Vince's journey as a single wing quarterback trying to make it is to learn about what formations are out there at that time and who makes it as a quarterback and the other black quarterbacks, right? And so what you realize is that in in 72, Vince graduates high school as a single wing quarterback. By 1977, he's in the NFL as a pro quarterback, where they're running what you call a pro style system, which is an offshoot of the T formation. So if listeners want to visualize this, there's the center, there's a quarterback right behind the center, and the T formation has three running backs behind them. Eventually in the NFL, they'll move one of those running backs as a wideout. And so if you grew up playing Madden, you would play in the pro style system, right? So it's
Mhm.
the quarterback with two running backs split behind them. And that's all they ever wanted to do. And that's all they accepted. And once that happens, that quarterback becomes the most important person on the field. And he's the leader, he's the smartest person. And that's what's kept that and American racism kept the black quarterback out. There's no room for a single wing quarterback. There's no room in the NFL for a veer quarterback or, listeners, if you guys are out there in Tennessee listening, like a Condredge Holloway is not going to make it because as good as he was in college, pros aren't running that system that Tennessee was running. I believe they're running the veer or something like that. And so Vince making it at that point is incredible because when he gets to the USC, they're running the I formation. Now, there's some I in the NFL, and that allows him to have a little bit of opportunity. But the I that he's running is he's rolling out as a passer, and there's no rollout in the NFL, right? They're not sending these linemen out because the quarterback's supposed to stand in the pocket. So just from the standpoint of him being a quarterback, it would be impossible for him to make it. And I think he understands that. And so what he does is understanding how hard it would be just from that standpoint, the quarterbacking position. And then when you add in the race factor, he does, I think, one of the biggest power moves in NFL history. And I hope, as people read this and we get to talk about it, these other athletes, black quarterbacks acknowledge this, is that when he signs his contract in 1977, he says to the Bears, you can't change my position without my permission. And I think that's so huge because everybody else that looked like him, who wasn't like this top guy, and there was like four or five before him, they got switched, right? Or they're going to Canada. And when he says that, that changes the game. That gives him the opportunity to sit and to learn the position that other guys that look like him didn't get.
Absolutely. I've talked to Walter Overton many times, who was one of the first black football players here at Vanderbilt, who was a quarterback at Pearl High School, where Perry Wallace had gone. It was an all-black school. Was able to play quarterback on the freshman team here, does quite well. But when it's time for him to move up to the varsity the next year, they move him to wide receiver, where the issue there, which you talk about in the book, is this concept of stacking, where all the black players are put at the same position so that there's, only a certain number on the field at any one time. I was at an event last night celebrating another former all-black school in Nashville, Cameron High School, that won state basketball tournaments in 1970 and 1971, and then the school was closed after 71 with the integration. So many black high schools were closed at that point. So you're right. Like, these are stories that were happening, it's very similar stories all over the South. Doug Williams from the South, but his story is a little different. He's not grown up in a city like Greensboro. He's not, you know, uh, integrating a school where he's from in Louisiana. Tell us about his background and how he arrives in the NFL.
Yeah, yeah. Doug is rural Louisiana, and what I say is like this. He's from a place called Cheneyville, and it's not even on the map, right? So it's not a city. It's really a community. It's a black community that's formed post Reconstruction, because black folks stayed on their land, and they weren't going anywhere. And then eventually, like the white owners of the land gave them uh, land for a school and a church, and that's where they stayed, right? They called the school Cheneyville. So one of the last names of the white guy's his last name was Cheney. So they called it Cheneyville, and it just expanded from that. Church and school, and they're a very prideful community. They liked owning land. They didn't have a lot of money, didn't have a lot of resources, but they had pride, right? And so, Doug grows up with no running water until he's a teenager. So, bathrooms in the outhouse. There's no paved roads. The schools get their first toilets, I think, in 1955. And one of the things I was kind of cautious about, like, should I put this in the book or not? But I just wanted to show the readers what kind of poverty it was. Like, students didn't know how to use urinals because they didn't have urinals like that. And they were kind of like, oh my gosh, what do we do here?
Mhm.
Um, it's a school that builds its own football field in the late 1950s, right? Because resources aren't coming there, but they understand that now it's a a community, but they understand that football is the growing sport. So they do build this football field, and things take off from there. It's a small school, but that's where Doug grew. And one of the things that gets me about Doug when he tells his story in book or interviews is that Friday nights KKK comes to town, right? And that the message is stay where you're at. Don't try to push for integration. So Doug and Vince are growing up heart of the civil rights movement, and the responses that they see, city versus country, kind of shape who they're going to be. Now Doug winds up, Vince will go to USC, Doug will go to Grambling, an all black school, and this is to me what gets him in the league because he just happens to go to the greatest college coach ever, but also a coach who was really focused on getting a black quarterback into professional football because he knew the meaning of that position to not only his guys there, but the rest of America. What it means to see a black person starting in the pro level doing well. And so Eddie Robinson in the early mid 1960s shifted his whole offense around. Now he's running a wing tee, which is again a running offense, but he shifted it, created it as a passing offense, and his quarterbacks took off. James Harris, Matthew Reed, and then Doug Williams. All those guys made it to the pros. Now Matthew doesn't get a chance to play in the NFL, but he'll play in the WFL and a little bit of Canada. But Harris has some good years with the Rams, some very racist years, but when he's with the Rams in 74, 75, 76, they make the NFC Championship. He's one of the winningest quarterbacks when it comes to like winning percentages. Now goes through a lot of stuff. And then there's Doug, and Doug's on a whole nother level.
We'll talk more about Vince Evans and Doug Williams, but in the book, I felt like you did a really good job of sharing the stories of some of the black quarterbacks that came before them in the NFL. People like Kenny Washington, Willie Thrower, Brackens with the Packers, Marlon Briscoe. Um, for listeners who aren't familiar with those names, can you tell us a little bit about the black quarterbacks whose shoulders, Vince Evans and Doug Williams stood on, the folks that maybe don't get, whose stories haven't been told as much?
Yeah, so one thing I said in that book is like, look, from the day you mentioned Choo Choo Bracken. So Choo Choo played for Green Bay briefly. He was their backup quarterback in 1955 as a rookie out of Prairie View. From that moment until Marlon Briscoe plays in 1968, every black college quarterback that made it to the pros did it at a different position. They're just switched. Now the other guys I wanted to tell a story about briefly, and this is like when you write, you can't tell everything, or else I would have told everything. This
Mhm.
was very brief. Like so the Kenny Washington point I was trying to make was just using him to show the readers that transition from the single wing to the T formation because Kenny was, if readers don't know, probably the best college football player late 1930s, regardless of race, regardless of school. Doesn't get an opportunity at first in the NFL because the NFL is segregated, right? They started out integrated, but they're segregated. But he's a single wing quarterback. And so what that meant in late 1939 is that they would hike him the ball. There'd be some trickery if he's gonna like, hand it off to Jackie Robinson or throw it. And if he's gonna throw it, it's just deep bombs, like 60 yards, and he had the best arm, but it's not precision passes. And so that time between the league when the league's keeping Kenny Washington out, and then he gets back in 1946, that's when all the changes happen with the quarterbacks. And so when he comes in, it's a T formation system, and he doesn't know it. But I think it's significant that the first person that the black community in LA, because they fight for him to get on the Rams when they move there, select is a quarterback, right? They could have fought for Woody Strode, a receiver. They could have fought for Jackie, right, who was just as good, and obviously he was playing pro at that time. Now he just finished with the Monarchs, signed with the Dodgers, but they could have made that fight like two sports star. But it was Kenny because he's a quarterback, and I think that means something because I think early on they knew the meaning of that position and leadership. The next person that gets a shot after Kenny lasts at quarterback for one game, and so I say he's the first. Other people say it's Willie Thrower, and he won't play until 1953. And I think what's cool about his situation is that he gets signed with the Bears, and he's kept on the team at a time where they weren't keeping three quarterbacks. So I think the Bears saw something in him. George Hollis, who's one of the inventors of the modern T formation, I think they there's some experiments that they probably wanted to try, but it just didn't work out. But he'll play. He'll get into two games, both against the 49ers, does okay, but they don't keep him in for the touchdown, and then he's done. And then it's Choo Choo Brackets in 1955, who comes from a pass heavy offense at a black college in Prairie View, very innovative offense. And that's it. But in telling these stories, whether it's those three, Briscoe, a little bit on Jim Gilliam, and Eldridge Dickey, right? So those folks who are from the Nashville area, Dickey was perhaps, it's fair to say, behind Doug Williams and Joe Gilliam as the greatest black college quarterback ever before like McNair and them, right? Up to that point.
Mhm.
But up to his point, he was the greatest ever. Just wanted to show folks like that there's guys out there, but also that the way the NFL pro football worked, but also um how important that position was by telling the story of how people root for or where they go. I wish I would have had more on Dickey, but just when it comes to like cutting stuff and editing, like a lot of that had to fall off. But I had some really good stuff on Dickey and his coach there. So
What did you learn or come away with on the variety of reasons that were given by coaches or owners or general managers about, why you couldn't have a black quarterback? I think you most often hear like, oh, they would say, like they weren't smart enough to run the offense. Maybe some expression like, I didn't really feel that they said it that often, but like this is going to be the face of the franchise. Were they concerned that reason? But even you mentioned that they were, can't remember if it was a coach or a GM that would say like the black quarterbacks, even the way they threw the ball, like wasn't good enough. That was a bizarre one I had never heard before. What were all the reasons that were given?
all of them, right? So, brains was one of them. Like, is he smart? Leadership, can he lead? Not only can he lead, but will his white teammates follow? And I think that's a big one, right? Will the white offensive line from the South follow him? And even when you look at Doug's team, when he gets onto the Bucks in '78, every offensive lineman they have is white guys from the deep South, right? And so that's a real question that folks have. The arm, the way he throws the ball, that comes from a 1968 article in the LA Times, that like a series on the black quarterback and where are they? And some unnamed person in the football was saying like he even throws it weird. It's like, like okay,
Yeah.
but to me that goes to training, right? And so one of the things we have to realize, those guys who made it, their coaches were really intentional on them having the opportunity. A lot of guys didn't get the chance because like let's especially the black quarterbacks from the black schools, they just don't have the resources to produce a black quarterback. And so one of the guys um, that I talked about, Andre Jackson, gets drafted in the fifth round by the Boston Patriots. And it's supposed to be like the next Willie Mays and just doesn't make it. But one of the things you learn from him and then the black GM Roman law that Boston Patriots had is that he's saying like, look, these black schools don't have resources, right? There's no quarterback coach, right? You might have three coaches tops, but even by the 1960s, you have quarterback coaches at the big schools. So they're learning these stuff. Whereas the black quarterback, they're there and they're running a single wing or they're running some kind of variation of an offense, a wing T or something like that. And there's really nobody there to like teach them the mechanics of a quarterback. So the guys that make it, your Dickies get moves, but your Joe Gilliams, your James Harris, they have coaches who are really intentional about that. So John Merritt, who's the Tennessee State coach, he's forward thinking and passing and quarterbacking. And in fact, Tennessee State's so good with their offense. Penn State comes to their school to study it, right? Like
Mhm.
that's how forward thinking their offense is with the pass. And so his guys know how to play. So it's not coincidence that he gets pro quarterbacks, Dickey, Joe Gilliam, and then there's another guy in 82, 83 with the Oilers right before Warren Moon gets there. Doesn't play at all, but because they're taught, right? And they're taught to be pro quarterbacks. Same thing with Eddie Robinson. These other guys, these other black quarterbacks aren't taught to be pro quarterbacks. If they're at a black school, they don't have the resources. If they're at a big time school like Michigan State, like Jimmy Ray, they're just there to run the offense and be an athlete, right? Like these guys aren't, it's not thought about their careers beyond college. And so that's why some of them struggle. The other stuff, I know I'm so long-winded today. Their dialect, right? There's black Southerners. Will people, just the way US stereotypes work, will people be able to understand these guys at all? So this is everything. And then their speed. They're just too fast, right? For the NFL. And the NFL is thinking, well, why wait for 3 to 5 years for you to be a quarterback when I can play you now? Right. And so all these things are working against them. And that's why it takes so long.
You mentioned that some guys would even run slower intentionally in their workouts, so they might be able to stick around at quarterback. Um,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah. Because if
oh,
you ran too fast, you're done.
yeah, wow. Um, I mean, I think that most people who study, the black athlete of the civil rights era are familiar with the Sports Illustrated series in '68 on the black athlete. You mentioned an article. I don't know if it was an article or a series. I think it was an article in 1977 in Time magazine called The Black Dominance, that you said hit the newsstands on the day of the draft or second day of the draft, which perfect when you're writing this story, right?
Right.
Um, what was the context of the way black athletes were perceived in across professional sports that was, illustrated in that article in Time magazine as, Vince Evans and Doug Williams are entering the league?
Yeah. I just think, it's one of the first times where America's coming to the realizations. So back up. I think they've always seen the black, days of Jesse Owens, like, oh, okay, what do we have here? But but it's like kind of buried away. It's thought about here in Time Magazine, everything's open in the 60s and 70s. And so there's this for the first time, not maybe not the first time, but you're really having these real conversations about how do you explain black dominance, right? Like what is it about these folks? And I think that's where it is. It's just all athletic dominance. It's like, okay, because by that time they've already dominated the NBA. Every major league record's like almost gone, right? And think about baseball in a quick generation. Babe Ruth gone. I think Lou Brock, stolen base gone. All
Mhm.
these other things that we think like these are, oh my gosh, look at this. They're just dominated, right? They've won multiple rookies of the years, MVPs and stuff like that. How do you explain that thing? And I think that's something that outside of hard work, nobody ever wants to give credit to hard work, right? Like people work really hard to be really good at sports. You have to explain the unthinkable, right? Because I think hard work was always something that people thought that black folks lacked, even though that's all they did was work hard. And so
Mhm.
the sports is the ultimate proof of that. And so sometimes you have to be able to explain it. And so that's what it is. It's just all these dealing with these racial stereotypes. And I think a lot of times people are just too ready just to assume that's the case, right? If it's the extra muscle, if it's like they have lack of opportunities and other things, so they pour it all into sports. So that's where it was, just a standard conversation that probably was had a lot of times in 1977.
Yeah, so when Williams and Evans come into the league, you would imagine that their relationship with their head coaches would be really important to like how this is going to go for them. Seems like Doug Williams stepped into a good situation in Tampa with John McKay being his coach. Could you talk a little bit more about McKay's experience with black quarterbacks going back to his college days and the ways that he defended Doug Williams against some stereotypes and media criticism?
Yes, yes. So they would call him, so some black writers would call him colorblind McKay, in the sense that, look, his USC teams, early 1970s, were half black. He had black quarterbacks too, right? And so even before he got Doug in 78, he had Jimmy Jones in 1969, 70, 71, and Jones was first black quarterback on the cover of Sports Illustrated. He's also the black quarterback that played with them when they went to Alabama, right? That game, when things changed college sports. It's McKay, it's a black quarterback. And then he has Vince Evans, right? And he always valued the black quarterback in the sense that the way the I formation set up, it's a running formation, but dang, what if I got this guy who can move too? Use him as a runner too. Now he's had some stand in the pocket quarterbacks. So like Pat Hayden. So when he gets Dog, I think it was nothing to him, and he was prepared, right? He was prepared for the racism that he got when he had Jimmy Jones. He was prepared for the racism he had when he had Vince Evans. So he was prepared, and I think that's what made things work with Doug, where he doesn't break down, because the other guys who came before him, Eldridge Dickey, got in some trouble because I think the racism was too much. Joe Gillum turned to drugs. Martin Briscoe eventually turned to drugs. Doug has somebody who understands everything that he's going through and is willing to speak up. And I think one of the best things that McKay did was, over the years, every time they tried to come at Doug, he took the heat for, and he tried to explain things away, like Doug's like low percentage of throwing, which, like, if he played today, people would lose their minds of how low percentage was. But McKay was like, look, we're throwing deep passes, and look, he's not going to eat these sacks, right? He's always trying to make these plays. So of course his percentage is going to look like this. This is the offense that we want, and that's the offense that they had. But the other thing is that he spoke out. Like, he spoke out about the racism that kept Doug from being the number one pick that falls to the 17th. Now, part of that is the Bucks also had the number one pick and traded it out to the Oilers, who picked Earl Campbell, and they fall to 17. And nobody picks Doug, which they should have, because he's the most prolific quarterback ever at that time. But also the way writers write about him, the way fans are, and he always has his back publicly about racism. It's probably one of the first times, or a few times, where a white coach does that with an athlete, you know, um, at all times has his back. And I think that eases things up for Doug. Doesn't end the racism at all, but I think it makes it easier for him.
And on the flip side, it felt like Vince Evans didn't really have that support either with the first coaching staff that he's working with in Chicago, or as the coordinators and head coaches change, right? It was another example of their stories being very different.
Yeah, constant change for Evans. But I think what's important about Evans' story, is we, like, project on today, is that eventually they realize in Chicago that, oh, we might have something here, right? And so his coach, Neil Armstrong, gets charged with being racist from black fans because he won't play Doug. Ditka gets charged with being a racist because he won't play Doug, not Doug, won't play Vince, and leans to McMahon. But there's this small moment in 80-81 where Armstrong, and then eventually they hired Ted Marchibroda, who's this great offensive mind. And it's the first time, really, I think, where the NFL tries to make a dual quarterback work. Now, there's no blueprint for them, and I think that's part of the reason why they fail, because they do want him to pass first, and Vince has a problem with accuracy a lot of times because he was never taught how to throw the ball. He doesn't throw with laces, and so if you pass first and you miss early on, you're in trouble, right? You're in second and long. It's like, oh, what are you going to do now? You've just taken Walter Payton out the game, right? And so there are issues with that. But this idea where they're like, okay, we have a guy who could run and get to the outside. How do you use that, right? Now they don't scheme a lot of things up for him where they could have, but they understand that this is what they have, and this is his strength, to be able to. He's a 4.5 40 guy, to get out of the pocket. How and when you do that, they didn't figure that out. And that, like I said, they're the first to try it. Every time now we see it, everybody's seen it, right? So like if you're watching like Lamar's offensive coordinator, especially when he had Greg Norman, Norman had seen things, right? And he had Kaepernick, he had some other stuff, and so there's stuff to build on. People had seen how how Randall operated or how you could operate with Mike Vick, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't have that back then, right? And so trying to figure that out in real time when you actually have a long history of losing and have bad quarterback play and the fans don't have time, they don't have patience, it's really hard to do.
Mhm. I think most people, if they just heard those two names right now, would consider Doug Williams to be the better player, the more illustration of success, with the Super Bowl. But you make a good, interesting point in the book that the fact that Vince Evans hung around for so long, what was he playing until 1990, I think, with the Raiders, and had an opportunity to be a backup quarterback was its own special victory in a way.
Yeah, wow, you read the whole thing. Yeah. So that mid 90s, right? And so he's man, he might be pushing 40 when he's done in his pro career. And I think that's another thing. So not only he's like the first true dual threat guy, and if we're not counting Briscoe, but which I'm not, obviously, if I say that. But the first long-term black backup, because to be a backup in the NFL, you're on the one hand you're taking up space, but generally goes to the white guy that the coach likes, right? Because you're not playing if you're third string. You're not really playing. You're on the team. You're taking up a roster spot, right? Emergency, emergency. And now today, like I think they've limited the third string quarterback, right? Like you have to make a conscious decision if you're keeping three guys. I think they only dress in two. Um, but to stay on, that was a big deal because guys, if we have no use for you as a black quarterback anymore, you're gone. So think about it. Doug wins the Super Bowl. They win in 88. He's gone by 90. There's no use, and no other team picks him up, even though he's still Doug Williams, right? And part of the reason why teams wouldn't have black backups is because they thought it'd be too much of a problem with fans because the fans would clamor for them to be put in the game. So the Raiders were comfortable with that. Not the fact that fans wouldn't clamor, but like we got this guy on our bench, and if we need to use him, we'll break him out. And occasionally they
Mhm.
broke him out. I mean, he even started a game when Art Shell was the coach, so the first black quarterback to start with a black head coach. Um, but now we're getting more comfortable with the fact that he can be the black backup and it won't be a major problem, especially for these older guys. So like Aaron Rodgers can have five straight bad games and no one's gonna want Tyrod Taylor in there. Same thing as last year. Daniel Jones was awful, but Tyrod Taylor was the backup. And then they fell on like Danny DeVito, whatever his name, Tommy DeVito. But Josh Johnson is the backup. And now some of these teams also are smart where they have like multiple black quarterbacks, so there is no problem, right? Like the Pittsburgh has two back in the day. Jacksonville Jaguars had three. It was like Leftwich, Garrod, and I want to say Quinn Gray and stuff like that. And so that eliminates a lot of the problems. But yeah, no, it's I think it's a big thing, right? That the fact that he's the first long-term guy that gets a shot and shows everybody that it's not a problem.
Yeah. Um, Now, I think a lot of folks, when they think about Doug Williams, and we've had this conversation before also about the perceived dumb question that he was asked before the Super
Mhm.
Bowl about how long he'd been a black quarterback. And you explain in the book that it actually was not a stupid question. Um, and you give the reporter his props, for asking actually an insightful question. So tell us that story.
Yeah, so I use that story actually not to start the Super Bowl chapter, which is my own editing decision, but to start it in his senior year, because the point I was trying to make is a black quarterback doesn't become a black quarterback until the white media discovers him, right? And or he's put in a white space. And so for Vince Evans, he's a black quarterback the moment he goes to this all white school. When he's at all these other black places when he's playing with his buddy, he's just a quarterback, right? Because he grows up in a black community. Doug Williams had always just been a quarterback because he goes to an all black school in high school, in college. And it's not till his senior year where the media discovers him, right? And now all of a sudden he goes from Doug Williams, the quarterback, to Doug Williams, the black quarterback. And that's the point I was trying to make. And I think that's what the reporter was asking. Like, when did that actually matter that you were a black quarterback? And the answer is it did not matter that he was a black quarterback until his senior year when he could have been Heisman. And that's when they discovered, like, oh, Doug Williams, the black quarterback. He was just wanted to be a quarterback. He was always a quarterback. Now you're a black quarterback because the white media has discovered you. You've entered this white space. I think that was the question. And I think he's answered that. Like he answered that in real time. Like, so these aren't me just making this up. This is Doug, in kind of dealing with this in 77 in real time because he had never had to deal with this, right? No, there's no attention. The attention he got occasionally from white press, but it's really in this kind of black college quarterback world. Now all of a sudden it's like, oh, this guy might come into this space.
How did both guys sort of deal with that question? I think on the one hand, sometimes it felt like they're like, why do we have to keep talking about this? On the other hand, recognizing that it's significant. Maybe the same that I don't know. Did you have any of those questions yourself, like when you're working on the book? Like, uh, how did they answer those questions, and how did you deal with it? Just even as the author of this story that at times has been, of course, it was a big deal when these guys weren't allowed to play the position. Yet at the same time, often they just wanted to stop talking about it and just be the quarterback of a football team and play the game they love to play.
Yeah, I think in real time they didn't like it because it isolated them as something different. And I think their coaches understood it, the people around them understood it, didn't understand it. And I don't think they had a clear grasp on what it actually meant to black fans. And I think once they understand that, like, oh, okay, there's something. And I think now, though, 50 years later, they really understand it and they're comfortable. And that's why they're always on. I mean, Prime just put out this documentary and they're celebrating, right? And so
Hmm.
in real time, it was something like, man, I just want to do my job, right? And no one else, because they're not asking the white quarterback what's it like to be a white quarterback.
All right.
They're not asking the white, they rarely, even to this day, they don't ask, CMC every day what it's like to be a white running back, right? And
Mhm.
or and we'll joke about the white cornerback. I think the Eagles have one, right? Well, like,
Yeah.
but no one's asking them every day, every day, every day. What does this mean? And I think they didn't like that in real time, as I said, because it isolated them. They're different. But now I think they're very comfortable with it because they understand that it wasn't really about them. It was about everybody else. And that was part of the story I was trying to tell in the story, right? With this idea of the black quarterback syndrome. People are rooting for you to do well because they're rooting for themselves to do well because they want opportunities too. And the quarterback is the most visible representation of lack of black opportunity, right? Because if I'm growing up in the 60s and 70s, I've seen a lot of great black quarterbacks. I've seen black quarterbacks at the championship level on TV, in bowl games, but for some reason, I don't see them in the NFL.
Mhm.
And if you're like the growth of the black middle class is kind of like that too, right? Okay, talking about these opportunities, post civil rights opportunities, people that look like me aren't in these positions, and that's a problem.
One of the last times we talked on a podcast was, I think, right before the Super Bowl, Mahomes versus Hurts, and you drew some parallels between both of those quarterbacks and Vince Evans and Doug Williams. What were those connections that you recognized?
Yeah, and so for Jalen, I think it's easy. Like it's just like they're just probably around the same size. They're I think Jalen's a lot slower than Vince Evans. But they're seen as runners who could throw the ball, and I think that's important. I think because the league is kind of going that way. You have to be athletic, whereas Mahomes and Williams are pocket passers who can run when they need to, right? So Doug is not. Doug got hurt his sophomore year, his in his sophomore year. And I think it took a little bit off his speed. So he was never a speed guy, but he was like Mahomes. He was fast as he needed to be. And so he was probably the second fastest quarterback in the league behind Vince Evans, but he could still truck it, get down, get that first down. And so he'd move as fast as he needed to move. And that's how Mahomes is. And Mahomes and Doug are gunslingers, right? And I mean, Doug's name is the Grambly Gunner, right? Or in high school they call him the Rifleman, because he could throw it deep. He could throw it 70 yards, throw any off platform, put it anywhere, probably threw the best ball in the game. It's just like kind of Mahomes. So they're very similar in that stature.
And wrapping things up, I mean, right now it seems like uh, you mentioned teams that have multiple black quarterbacks. Packers fan, we've got Love and Willis right now. You look across the league. most of the best quarterbacks in the league are black. Like, and yet the most prominent black quarterback of the last 10 or 15 years are like blackballed from the game. You know, the NFL dealing with all the well-told stories about racism in the league among owners or coaches, coaching opportunities. Like, how would you assess the state of the black player and specifically the black quarterback in the NFL right now?
Yeah. So I'll say I like what's going on because in the book and early on, I think in the introduction, I said the future is black, right? I think I said at the beginning, I said it at the end, and that's just kind of me predicting it because that's where the game's going, right? Because that's what the college is giving the NFL, and finally the NFL has realized that we got to take what we get versus, and Eddie Robinson made this prediction in 1974. He just didn't know that the NFL's like, yeah, we're not doing the V or anything like that, right? But now the games is kind of meshed and the game is healthy, but it doesn't mean the problems have gone away. And I think sometimes like it's not as like crystal clear, like the criticism that Justin Fields would have taken last year. It's not as crystal clear that it's a black quarterback thing, but to me, if you've done the reading and you understand the history, it's very clear. Like when we talk about how you process things and how slow you process it, and then we mix it in with, oh, but you want to get out and scoot and run really fast and stuff like that, then I think we're treading in those old tropes. So I think that's where we are, but it's so healthy, and that's what's so fun about having this book out right now. That this book really talks about uses two guys to explore this issue, and I think my readers are really smart and they can make the connection, so I don't have to be like explicit every time, like you know, you know what I mean, and
Yeah.
call Vince like the Lamar Jackson of his day, like every time. So no, I'm really lucky to have a book out right now.
Yeah, well, congratulations on the book. Thanks for coming on this show the first week that it's out. I'm really happy for you and for the timing of this book. For people who are interested in it, like how can they follow you? Where can they find the book?
So all the socials, if you figure out like Prof. Lou Moore, like that'll get you somewhere on all the socials. When it comes to the book, it's everywhere. It's even probably at your local Barnes and Noble. They might have one copy, so you might have to, if you don't buy it, just please set it face forward so someone else can buy it. So it's not hidden, but you can get it everywhere online. And so I'm really, that's the difference. Another thing different between the academic world and the trade press is that there's more options to get these things. So you can get it anywhere you want. I'm pretty excited about that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Lou, thank you so much. Good talking to you. I'm sure our fantasy football teams will be playing
Oh,
soon.
I can't wait to beat you. I can't wait. I
I
cannot.
think I'm the only undefeated team in the league.
We don't need to hear about that. We don't need to hear about that.
All right. Well, you have a good day. Take care,
All
man.
right. All right,
Bye.
thanks.